Somewhere in the last few years, the money in your account started losing its value, and there was no gauge to tell you it was happening. The people paid to watch that gauge already know it is gone. That is why central banks have spent 3 straight years buying gold faster than in half a century, and why some of them are quietly flying that gold out of foreign vaults and back onto their own soil in the dark, while telling you the dollar is fine. The debt underneath it has passed $39 trillion, with nothing behind it but belief. It all traces back to a single contradiction one man wrote down in 1960, carried into the United States Congress, and watched get filed away for the rest of his life. He was right to the season, but the trap he found was never closed. It was only hidden. Before we go deeper, get comfortable and subscribe or join if you haven't, because this is a thread we pull all the way to the bottom. There is a Patreon too, where these same rabbit holes run wider, through physics, history, and the collapse of things that once looked permanent. Stay to the end, because by then you will understand why the dollar is not dying in spite of its dominance. It is dying because of it. Let's go back to where this began. In October of 1959, a man walked into a hearing room inside the United States Congress and told a committee of American lawmakers to their faces that their money was going to fail. Not weaken, not wobble. Fail, he told them that the dollar, the currency that had just financed the winning of a world war, the currency that was in the middle of rebuilding half the planet, the currency sitting on top of the largest hoard of gold any nation had ever assembled in the history of the species, was structurally doomed. And he did not say it the way a preacher on a street corner says it. He said it the way a structural engineer tells you a bridge is going to come down. Quietly, with numbers, with a date range, with a mechanism you could check. His name was Robert Triffin. He was a Belgian who had become an American, an economist who had worked inside the Federal Reserve and inside the International Monetary Fund, a man who had spent years with his hands on the actual plumbing of the post-war money system. And what he told that committee was not a warning about bad management. He was very specific about this. He was not saying that if the Treasury made smarter choices, or if Congress spent a little less, the danger would pass. He was saying the opposite. He was saying that the danger could not pass, because the danger was not a mistake anyone had made. The danger was built into the design. The thing that made the dollar the most powerful currency on Earth was the same thing that guaranteed it would eventually destroy itself. Success and self-destruction were not two outcomes the system might have. They were the same process, running forward, and you could not have one without the other. 12 years later, almost to the season, he was proved right. On a Sunday evening in August of 1971, a president of the United States went on television and, in the middle of a speech about prosperity, quietly detonated the entire monetary order that the Western world had lived under since the end of the war. Everything Triffin had described in that hearing room happened, in the order he said it would happen, for the reason he said it would happen. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you before we go one step further. The reason this matters is not that a man made a lucky prediction. Economists make predictions constantly, and most of them are noise. What should bother you is why he was right. Because if Triffin was right about the mechanism, and the historical record says he was, then the flaw he found was never fixed. It could not be fixed. It was patched over, renamed, moved into a different room of the building, and the same clock he was reading in 1959 is still running right now over your head, in the dollars moving through the account your salary lands in. It is running faster than it has ever run, and almost nobody is telling you what the dial says. Let me be clear about what kind of claim this is, because your instinct right now is probably to file it under conspiracy, and it is the exact opposite of that. This was not whispered. Triffin published it. In 1960, Yale University Press printed his book, a slim, dry, devastating volume called Gold and the Dollar Crisis. It was reviewed. It was debated by the most serious monetary economists alive. It has a name in the textbooks. They call it the Triffin Dilemma, and if you have taken a graduate course in international economics, you have met it on a slide, sandwiched between two other slides, presented as a solved historical curiosity, a thing that happened once, back in the age of gold, and got dealt with. That framing is the lie, not a lie anyone tells on purpose, a lie of tone. Because the dilemma was never a historical curiosity. It is a description of a trap that any country issuing the world's money walks into by the act of issuing it forever, and the reason you were handed the calm past tense version is that the present tense version is not comfortable to teach. The question I want to hold in front of you for the next couple of hours is deceptively simple, and I want you to notice that it has no clean answer. The question is this: can a single national currency serve the entire world without eventually consuming itself in the process? Not should it. Can it? Is there a version of this arrangement that survives? Or does the arrangement carry the seed of its own ending inside the very feature that makes it work? Triffin's answer was no. There is no stable version. And the more I have read of what came after him, the more I have watched serious people spend 60 years trying to prove him wrong and failing, the harder it has become to find the flaw in what he saw. To understand why, you have to understand the trap itself. And the trap is beautiful in the way that a mathematical proof is beautiful, which is to say it is beautiful and it does not care how you feel about it. Start with a simple fact about the world after 1945. The war had flattened Europe and Japan. Their factories were rubble, their currencies were waste paper, their gold had crossed the Atlantic years earlier to pay for guns and food. At the end of it, the United States held something close to 2/3 of all the monetary gold on the planet, around 20,000 tons of it, sitting in vaults, most famously under a small building in Kentucky, whose name became a kind of national shorthand for wealth itself. Every other major economy was broke. And a broke, rebuilding world has a very specific need. It needs money. Not its own money, which nobody trusts yet. It needs money that everyone will accept. Money that a Brazilian exporter and a French importer and a Japanese shipbuilder can all agree is worth something. In 1945, there was exactly one currency on Earth that fit that description, and it was backed by that mountain of gold, and it was the dollar. And the world reached for dollars. It had to. To buy oil, you needed dollars. To buy American machinery to rebuild your bombed-out factory, you needed dollars. To hold something in your central bank's vault that would not evaporate in the next crisis, you wanted dollars, because dollars were as good as gold. The United States had promised in writing at a resort in New Hampshire in 1944 that it would exchange dollars for gold at a fixed price, $35 for 1 ounce, to any foreign government that asked. That promise was the anchor of the entire system. A dollar was not just paper. A dollar was a claim check on a specific weight of metal in an American vault. Now watch the trap close, because it closes so gently you almost do not see it happen. If the whole world runs on dollars, the whole world needs a steady growing supply of dollars. Global trade is expanding. New countries are industrializing. Every year there is more commerce that needs to be settled, more reserves that need to be held, and all of it hungers for dollars. There is only one country on the planet that can print dollars, and that is the United States. And the only way for the world to get the dollars it needs is for those dollars to leave the United States and go out into the world and stay there. And there is only one way for dollars to leave and stay gone, in that volume. The United States has to send more money out than it takes back in. It has to buy more than it sells, pay out more than it collects, run a permanent deficit with the rest of the world. That is not a policy choice. That is arithmetic. If America ran a surplus, if it took in more dollars than it sent out, it would be sucking dollars out of the global system, starving the world of the very liquidity that keeps trade alive, and the world economy would seize like an engine run dry. Therefore, to be the world's currency, the dollar must flood out of America and pool up in foreign hands. That is obligation number one. The system needs it. But hold on, every single one of those dollars sitting in a foreign central bank is not just money. Remember the promise. Every dollar abroad is a claim check on American gold. It is a little paper certificate that says, at any moment, the holder may walk up to the United States Treasury and demand a specific slice of that mountain in Kentucky. And here is the second obligation, the one that sits directly across the table from the first one and stares at it. For the dollar to be trusted, for it to keep being as good as gold, the United States must always, credibly, be able to honour every one of those claim checks. The gold in the vault has to be enough to cover the dollars in the world. Now put the two obligations next to each other and feel them grind. To supply the world, America must send out an ever-growing tide of dollars. To stay trusted, America must keep enough gold to redeem those dollars. But the gold does not grow. There is a fixed mountain in Kentucky. It does not breed. Meanwhile, the dollars multiply every single year, because they have to, because the world demands them, and the pile of foreign-held dollars climbs, and the pile of gold sits still, and somewhere out ahead of you there is a line, a crossing point, a specific moment when the dollars owed to foreigners will exceed the gold available to pay them. And after that moment, the promise is a lie. Not a lie in intent, a lie in fact. The claim checks outnumber the metal. If everyone showed up at once, they could not all be paid. The dollar would still say it was as good as gold, but the arithmetic underneath it would already have failed, silently, years before anyone was forced to admit it out loud. That is the Triffin dilemma. Read it again as the sentence that it is. The reserve currency issuer must run deficits to supply the world, and those very deficits, continued long enough, must destroy the confidence that made the currency worth holding in the first place. The behaviour that feeds the system is the behaviour that poisons it. There is no dial you can turn, no wise policy, no disciplined Treasury Secretary who can make both things true at once. You can supply the world and lose its trust, or you can keep the world's trust and starve it of money. You cannot do both. The exit is sealed. That is why Triffin kept using a word that economists almost never use, because it sounds too much like fate. He called it a contradiction. Not a problem, a contradiction. Problems have solutions. Contradictions only have consequences. I want to sit inside that hearing room for a second, because the human picture matters here, and it is going to matter more later. Picture the men on the other side of the table. It is 1959. America has never been richer. The vaults are full. The dollar is king. And a soft-spoken Belgian with a Harvard doctorate is telling them that the fullness of those vaults is an illusion of timing, that the richest country in the history of the world is already, on paper, walking toward insolvency in slow motion, and that the very strength everyone is celebrating is the engine of the coming failure. It is not an easy thing to hear. It is not a thing that a room full of people at the top of the world wants to believe. And they did what people at the top of the world usually do with that kind of message. They thanked him, and they filed it, and they went on running the system exactly as before. which is the first thread I need you to hold, because it will come back with weight. Triffin did not just diagnose the disease. He spent the rest of his life, decades of it, trying to build the cure. He had a plan. He had more than one. He would propose and refine and lobby and testify again and again for a way out of the trap, a different kind of money that would not carry the poison. And the world would listen politely and take a piece of what he offered and never take the whole thing, because the whole thing was inconvenient to the country that benefited most from the trap. He would die having watched the one serious attempt to escape the dilemma get built on another continent, in another currency, and he would not live long enough to see whether even that escape would hold. Keep him in mind. The man who saw the trap most clearly also spent his life failing to spring it, and there is a reason that failure was not his fault, because here is what makes this more than an economics lecture, and here is the thread that should make the back of your neck cold. Everything I have just described to you, the flooding out, the fixed anchor, the climbing pile of claims, the crossing point where the promise quietly becomes a lie, all of it happened once already, on gold, and ended in 1971. But the mechanism did not die in 1971. When they cut the dollar loose from gold, they did not remove the trap. They removed the one thing that was forcing anyone to measure it. The gold was the gauge. It was the needle on the dial that told you how far past the line you were. And in 1971, the response to the needle hitting the red was not to fix the engine. It was to rip out the gauge. The same arrangement is running today. The world still needs dollars. America still has to supply them by sending out more than it takes in, and it does, on a scale that would have made the men in that 1959 hearing room physically ill. The pile of foreign claims on the United States is not measured against a mountain of gold anymore, because there is no longer any gold standing behind the dollar at all. There is nothing behind it now except the belief that it will keep being worth something. Which means the crossing point Triffin warned about, the moment the claims outrun the ability to honour them, still exists. It still sits somewhere out ahead of us, or, and this is the thought I cannot put down, somewhere already behind us, crossed years ago in the dark, with no gold gauge left to tell us it happened. That is where we are going. But to understand how close the second run of this clock has come, you have to understand the first run in full. You have to see exactly how the trap was built, who built it, who tried to warn them while they were building it, and what it looked like when the arithmetic finally came due. Because the men who designed this system were not fools. Some of the finest minds of the 20th century sat in that room in New Hampshire in 1944. One of them saw the whole thing coming and was overruled. And the reason he was overruled tells you almost everything about why the trap was unavoidable in the first place. The room was the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July of 1944. 730 delegates from 44 nations came up into the mountains for 3 weeks while the war was still burning, to design the money of the world that would exist after the shooting stopped. And the central argument of that conference, the argument that decided the shape of everything that followed, was a duel between two men who represented two completely different visions of what money between nations should even be. On one side was John Maynard Keynes. You know the name. He was, by 1944, the most famous economist alive, a giant of a man, brilliant and imperious, and physically failing, with a heart condition that would kill him less than 2 years later. Keynes came to Bretton Woods representing a bankrupt Britain, an empire that had spent itself into ruin fighting Hitler, and he came with a proposal that was, in hindsight, an attempt to defuse the exact bomb that Triffin would spend his life warning about. Keynes understood the danger of building the world's money system on top of any single nation's currency. He had watched it happen with the pound sterling. He knew what it did to a country to carry that weight, and he knew what it did to the world to depend on it. And Keynes proposed something genuinely radical. He wanted to invent a new kind of money that belonged to no country at all. He called it bancor. It would be an international reserve unit issued and managed by a global clearing institution, a kind of central bank for central banks, and it would sit above all national currencies as the neutral thing they settled their accounts in. No single country would print it. No single country would carry the burden or reap the privilege of issuing the world's reserves. The whole point was to take the job of being the world's money away from any one nation, because Keynes could see, even then, that giving that job to a national currency was handing that nation a poison chalice dressed up as a crown. Bancor was the escape hatch, designed before the trap had even finished being built. And it lost. It lost because the man on the other side of the table held all the cards, and his name was Harry Dexter White. White was an American Treasury official, and he was negotiating from the strongest position any negotiator has ever held. Britain was broke and in debt to the United States for its very survival. America held the gold, held the factories, held the armies, held the leverage. White did not need to compromise, and on the thing that mattered most, he did not. The American plan put the dollar at the centre. Gold would be the formal anchor, $35 to the ounce, but in practice the dollar would be the working reserve of the world, because the dollar was the only currency convertible into gold, and every other currency would define itself against the dollar. It was a system that made the dollar the sun and every other currency a planet, and for the United States in 1944, that was not a burden. That was the spoils of victory. Why would you build a neutral international money and hand away the greatest financial privilege in history when you could simply be the money instead? Keynes was overruled. Bancor died in the mountains of New Hampshire, and the delegates signed an agreement that took the world's oldest monetary instinct, trust in gold, and welded it to a single nation's paper, and called the world permanent. There is a story, probably too clean to be entirely true but told by people who were there, that Keynes left Bretton Woods privately certain that the thing they had built would not last, that they had solved the problem of the moment by planting a contradiction that would detonate later on someone else's watch. Whether he said it in those words or not, the record of his own bancor proposal shows he understood the danger with total clarity. He simply did not have the power to stop it. The most powerful economist of his century watched the trap get built, named the alternative, and was told no by a country that had no reason to listen. That is worth holding on to, because it establishes the pattern that is going to repeat for the next 80 years. The escape from the dilemma was on the table before the dilemma had even sprung. It was not that nobody thought of a way out. It is that the way out required the country holding the crown to voluntarily set it down, and no country in the history of money has ever done that until it was forced to at gunpoint by events. And this is where Robert Triffin enters the actual machinery, because while Keynes was the prophet who lost the argument at the top, Triffin was the technician who spent the next 15 years watching the consequences from inside the engine room. Let me tell you who he actually was, because the shape of his life is not incidental to what he saw. It is the reason he saw it. He was born in 1911 in a small town in Belgium called Flobecq, into a world that was about to tear itself apart. He was 3 years old when the First War came through his country. He grew up in the wreckage between the wars, a serious, devout, left-leaning Catholic boy who developed 2 convictions early and held them until he died. The first was a deep pacifism, a horror of the nationalism that had turned Europe into a slaughterhouse twice in his lifetime. The second was the belief, which flowed directly from the first, that if you could fix the way nations handled money between themselves, you could remove one of the great causes of the hatred between them. For Triffin, monetary economics was never a dry technical field. It was a peace project. He believed, with something close to religious intensity, that a better money system could make the world less likely to burn. One of his biographers called him a monk in an economist's clothing, and that is exactly right. He was not chasing prestige. He was chasing salvation in the specific and unglamorous form of exchange rates and reserve balances. He was brilliant enough to get out. He studied at the Catholic University of Louvain, and in 1935 he won a scholarship to Harvard, where he earned a doctorate in economics and studied under Joseph Schumpeter, one of the towering theorists of the age. And then history did the thing it kept doing to Triffin. In 1940, while he was in America, the Nazis invaded Belgium. The country he had left was overrun by exactly the kind of force his pacifism was built against. In 1942, with the world at war, Robert Triffin became an American citizen. Remember that act, a Belgian who fled the collapse of Europe and took American citizenship as a refuge from the darkness. It is going to close a circle at the very end of this story in a way that I still find hard to sit with. As an American, he went to work in the machine, first at the Federal Reserve from 1942, where he ran monetary missions into Latin America, walking into countries and helping them redesign their central banks and their currencies from the ground up. This is where he stopped being a theorist and became a mechanic. He learned hands-on how the plumbing of a monetary system actually behaves, where it clogs, where it leaks, how confidence in a currency is built, and how it drains away. Then, in 1946, he moved to the newly created International Monetary Fund, the institution born at Bretton Woods. And later he worked on the rebuilding of Europe's tangled post-war payments. He spent the better part of a decade with his hands inside the exact system that Keynes and White had designed. And what he saw from the inside was the trap closing in real time, in numbers on real ledgers, while everyone above him was still celebrating the strength of the dollar. Because the 1950s were, on the surface, the golden age. The system worked. Europe rebuilt. Trade exploded. The dollar was rock solid, gold flowed, and the men who ran the world congratulated themselves on the wisdom of Bretton Woods. But Triffin was watching a different set of numbers, and the numbers told a story that contradicted the mood completely. He was watching the two piles. The pile of dollars accumulating in foreign hands, which was rising, year after year, exactly as the logic demanded, because the world needed those dollars, and the only way to get them was for America to send them out. And the pile of gold in the American vaults, which was not rising, which was, in fact, beginning to fall, as some of those foreign dollar holders quietly started doing the thing the promise entitled them to do, walking up to the window and trading paper for metal. And Triffin could do the arithmetic that nobody in charge wanted to do out loud. He could see the two lines on the graph, the dollars climbing and the gold flat or falling, and he could see that they were going to cross. He could see approximately when, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a man reading a fuel gauge, that the crossing was not a risk to be managed. It was a certainty to be scheduled. The system was not at risk of failing because someone might mismanage it. The system was going to fail because it was working exactly as designed, and working as designed was the failure. This is the thing I need you to really absorb, because it is the hinge of the entire story, and it is the thing the textbooks sand down into nothing. In almost every crisis you have ever heard about, the villain is a mistake. Somebody borrowed too much, somebody lied on the forms, somebody got greedy, somebody fell asleep at the switch. We are comfortable with that story because it implies a fix. Find the mistake, punish the guilty, tighten the rule, and it will not happen again. Triffin was telling the world something far more disturbing than a story about a mistake. He was telling them there was no mistake. Everyone was doing their job correctly. The Treasury was supplying the world with the dollars it needed. Foreign governments were holding those dollars because they were the best reserve asset on Earth. The Federal Reserve was maintaining the value of the currency. Every single actor in the system was behaving responsibly, and the sum of all that responsible behaviour was a slow, mathematically guaranteed march toward the moment when the promise underneath the dollar would become impossible to keep. Nobody had to fail for the system to fail. The system failing was what success looked like from the inside. That is a genuinely different category of danger, and human institutions are almost incapable of responding to it, because every tool we have for managing danger assumes the danger comes from someone doing something wrong. When the danger comes from everyone doing everything right, the institutional response is paralysis. Because there is no one to blame, and no lever to pull, and no rule to tighten. And the only real solution, the Keynes solution, the bancor solution, requires the most powerful country on earth to give up the greatest privilege it has ever held. And so the institutional response, faced with a contradiction it could not solve, was the response institutions always choose when they cannot solve something. They decided not to look at it. They thanked the Belgian, and they filed his testimony, and they kept the machine running, because the machine was making everyone rich, and the crossing point was still a few years out. And a few years is forever to a government. But the numbers did not care that no one was looking at them. The dollars kept climbing, the gold kept flowing out. And Triffin, watching from the outside now, having left the official machine to take a professorship at Yale, decided that if the people running the system would not read the gauge, he would force the gauge into public view. He would write it all down, in plain language, with the numbers attached, and put it in front of Congress, and put it between hard covers, and dare the world to keep pretending. He did exactly that in 1959 and 1960. And what happened next is the part of the story where the arithmetic he had described stopped being a prediction and started being the news. Because the crossing point he had warned about, the moment the dollars owed to foreigners would exceed the gold available to redeem them, did not arrive in some distant decade. It arrived almost immediately. It arrived while the ink on his book was still fresh, and the way the most powerful institutions in the world responded to watching his prophecy come true, in real time, in front of them, is where this stops being a story about economics and becomes a story about denial. In 1960, the year Triffin's book came out, the two lines crossed. For the first time since the end of the war, the total number of dollars held outside the United States, the claims foreigners held against American gold, rose past the value of the gold actually sitting in American vaults. The mountain in Kentucky had been the largest hoard of monetary gold in human history, and it was no longer big enough. On paper, in that year, the promise underneath the dollar became unkeepable. If every foreign holder had shown up at the gold window at once, the United States could not have paid them. The claim checks now outnumbered the metal. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No alarm rang. This is the quiet horror at the centre of the whole thing, and it is why Triffin mattered. The failure was not an event. It was a threshold, crossed silently, years before anyone would be forced to acknowledge it. The dollar on that day looked exactly as strong as it had looked the day before. It still said, on its face, as good as gold. Trade still flowed, reserves still built. The only thing that had changed was that the statement was now false, and almost no one was doing the arithmetic that would have told them so. Triffin was. He had told them the year before that this crossing was coming, and now it had come, and the world's response was to keep behaving as though the thing he had described could not be true because it was too uncomfortable to be true. I want you to understand how precise his warning had been, because this is not a case of a pessimist being vaguely gloomy and getting lucky. In his testimony to the Congressional Committee and in the book, Triffin laid out the exact mechanism. He said the gold dollar system contained what he called a fundamental disequilibrium. He said the United States faced a choice between two roads and that both roads led off a cliff. Road 1. America stops running deficits, stops flooding the world with dollars, defends its gold. Result, the world is starved of reserves, global trade chokes, and you get deflation and stagnation spreading out from the centre, a slow strangling of the world economy for lack of the money it runs on. Road 2. America keeps supplying the world, keeps the dollars flowing, keeps trade alive. Result, the pile of foreign claims keeps climbing past the gold, confidence eventually cracks, and the system collapses in a run. Deflationary strangulation on one path, a confidence collapse on the other. Those were the options. There was no third road where everything was fine. He said this in 1959. The first crossing happened in 1960, and the confidence collapse he described on Road 2 arrived precisely in 1971. That is not a lucky guess. That is a man who understood the machine so completely that he could tell you which way it would break and roughly when, more than a decade before it broke, and be right on both counts. And the reason his name is a footnote instead of a headline is not that he was wrong. It is that being right about this particular thing was politically useless, because the only action his correctness demanded was an action the powerful were unwilling to take. Here is where the abdication becomes visible, and it is worth naming clearly, because the people running the system were not stupid and they were not blind. By the early 1960s, the men at the top of the American Treasury and the Federal Reserve knew. They had read Triffin. They understood the dilemma. Internal documents from the Kennedy administration show officials wrestling directly with the gold drain, watching the reserves fall, fully aware that the arithmetic was against them. They knew the promise was becoming hollow, and they made a decision not to fix it, because it could not be fixed without surrendering the dollar's central role, but to defend the appearance of it for as long as possible, to keep the game going, to manage the crisis of confidence rather than resolve the contradiction that caused it, because resolving it was unthinkable and managing it bought time, and buying time to a government is almost always preferable to solving a problem, because the solution is painful now and the collapse is somebody else's term in office. And they started propping it up, and the propping up is a story of increasingly desperate improvisation by the most powerful financial authorities on earth, all of it aimed at hiding a truth that Triffin had already published for free. The most revealing of these props was a thing called the London Gold Pool. By 1961, the pressure on the dollar was leaking into the open market price of gold. The official price was $35 an ounce, the sacred number, the anchor of everything. But in the free market in London, buyers who could see the same arithmetic Triffin saw were bidding the price up, because they suspected the official price was a fiction that could not hold. If the London price broke away from $35 and stayed above it, the whole world would see that the market no longer believed the dollar was as good as gold, and the run would begin. To prevent exactly that, 8 nations, led by the United States, secretly pooled their own gold reserves and used them to intervene in the London market, selling their national treasure into the market whenever the price threatened to rise, in order to force it back down to $35 and keep the illusion alive. Think about what that actually was. The richest governments in the world were spending down the very gold whose scarcity was the problem, in order to hide the fact that it was scarce. They were burning the evidence to conceal the crime. It was the financial equivalent of a man taking out new loans to keep up the appearance that he is not in debt. And it is here, in the middle of this frantic propping up, that the second thread of the story tightens, because not everyone was fooled, and one of the men who was not fooled was sitting in a palace in Paris. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, had an economic advisor named Jacques Rueff, a brilliant and combative monetary economist who had read the same numbers and reached a conclusion as sharp as Triffin's. Though he pointed it in a different direction, Rueff looked at the gold dollar system and saw something that enraged him. He saw that the arrangement let the United States buy real goods, real companies, real assets all over the world and pay for them with paper dollars that it could simply print, dollars that foreigners were then expected to hold rather than cash in for gold. Rueff called this a monstrous privilege, and a French finance minister of that era, a young man named Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, gave it the name that stuck, a phrase that has followed the dollar ever since. He called it America's exorbitant privilege. The privilege of being the world's currency, the privilege of paying your foreign bills in money you alone are allowed to create. De Gaulle, advised by Rueff, decided to call the bluff. In the mid-1960s, France began systematically doing the thing the promise permitted, but which everyone understood would break the system if too many people did it. France started cashing in its dollars for American gold, deliberately as policy. De Gaulle stood up and publicly called for the world to return to a pure gold standard, to strip the dollar of its exorbitant privilege, and he backed his words by sending French dollars back across the Atlantic and demanding metal in return. There is a story, again perhaps too vivid to be perfectly accurate, but rooted in real events, that France sent warships to carry its gold home. What is certainly true is that the French gold demands were relentless and pointed and designed to expose exactly what Triffin had exposed on paper, that the emperor's vault was emptier than the emperor claimed, and every ounce that left for France made the arithmetic worse for everyone who stayed, because the gold pile, already too small, was now actively shrinking as the doubters pulled their metal out, while the dollar pile kept growing. The London gold pool was fighting a losing war against arithmetic, spending gold to hide the shortage of gold, and the shortage got worse every time it fought. I need you to hold a specific image now, because it is the second time I am going to point at the thing waiting for us at the end of this story, and I want you to feel it arriving before you can see it clearly. That crossing point in 1960, the moment foreign dollar claims first passed American gold, was the true beginning of the end. Everything after it, the gold pool, the French raids, the diplomatic pressure, the decade of improvisation, all of it was happening after the system had already quietly failed. The collapse in 1971 was not the moment the system broke. It was the moment the world was finally forced to admit that it had broken 11 years earlier. The break and the admission of the break were separated by more than a decade. The gauge went red in 1960. They spent 11 years arguing with the gauge. Now hold that structure in your mind, because we are going to run this exact clock a second time in our own era, and the thing I want you to be watching for is not the collapse. It is the crossing point, the silent one, the one that comes years before the collapse and looks like nothing at all. Because if the first run of this machine teaches you anything, it is that by the time the failure becomes visible, it is ancient history. The dangerous moment is not the crash. The dangerous moment is the quiet crossing that happens in a year when everything still looks fine, and which you only recognise as the point of no return long after you have passed it. In the first run, that year was 1960. In our run, I am going to try to convince you that year is already behind us. But we are getting ahead of the machine. Back in the 1960s, the improvisation could not hold forever, and the men running it knew it could not hold forever. And Triffin, watching from Yale, knew the exact form the ending would take, because he had already described it. The London gold pool, that desperate scheme to burn gold in order to hide the scarcity of gold, was going to run out of gold to burn. And when it did, the free market price would break away from the official price. The whole world would see at once that the dollar was not as good as gold and had not been for years, and the slow crossing of 1960 would finally become the fast collapse that everyone had spent a decade pretending would never come. That is exactly what happened, and it happened faster and uglier than even the pessimists expected. The London gold pool broke in March of 1968. The demand for gold in the free market became so violent, so relentless, that the 8 nations propping up the price were hemorrhaging metal at a rate they could not sustain. In the space of a few weeks, enormous quantities of gold poured out of the pool as speculators and central banks alike bet against the official price. The authorities flew into emergency session, closed the London gold market for 2 weeks, and finally surrendered the pretense in a way that told anyone paying attention exactly how bad things had become. They split the price in two. There would now be an official price of $35 an ounce, used only between governments, a ceremonial number for the books, and a separate free market price that would be allowed to float wherever the market drove it. This was called the two-tier system, and it was a confession dressed as a policy. It was the monetary authorities of the West admitting that they could no longer hold the real price of gold at the official price, that the market and the promise had diverged, and that from now on they would simply maintain 2 sets of numbers and hope no one looked too closely at the gap between them. Triffin had told them 9 years earlier that this was where the road led, and now here they were, running 2 prices for the same metal, because the single honest price would have exposed the whole system. The 2-tier split bought a little more time. It did not fix anything, because nothing could fix anything, because the problem was not a price. The problem was the contradiction, and the contradiction was still there, growing. As the dollars kept flooding out, and the gold kept sitting still, and the gap between claims and metal widened every single month. By the summer of 1971, the end was visibly close. The American Gold Reserve, that legendary mountain, had fallen from around 20,000 tons after the war to roughly 8,000 tons. And against it stood a mass of foreign-held dollars many times larger than the gold could ever cover. Foreign governments, watching the arithmetic curdle, began to move. Britain, in the second week of August, reportedly requested that the United States guarantee the gold value of a very large dollar holding, a polite way of asking for metal, or the promise of metal, before the music stopped. France was already pulling gold. The run that Triffin had described as the endpoint of Road 2 was beginning, not as a panic in the streets, but as a quiet accelerating stampede of central bankers toward the exit, each one trying to convert paper to gold before the others emptied the vault. And so, on the weekend of the 13th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon took a small group of his most senior economic officials up to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, and for 2 days, in total secrecy, they decided how to kill the system that Keynes and White had built 27 years earlier. The room included the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, and the man who would matter most in this story, the Treasury Secretary, a large, blunt, forceful Texan named John Connolly, and a younger official named Paul Volcker, who understood the international system as well as anyone in the government, and who would, a decade later, become one of the most consequential central bankers in American history. These men knew exactly what they were deciding. They knew they were about to break the promise that had anchored the Western monetary order since the war. The only question was how to break it. Connolly was the one with no hesitation, and the reason is worth understanding, because it is the reason the second run of this machine works the way it does. Connolly did not see the end of gold convertibility as a defeat. He saw it as a liberation. His view, expressed with a bluntness that has echoed for 50 years, was that the whole arrangement had things backwards. The United States had been acting as though its obligation to redeem dollars for gold was a chain around its neck. Connolly understood that the dollar's centrality was not a weakness to be defended, but a weapon to be used. Why should America bleed gold to honour a promise, when it could simply stop honouring the promise, and the world, having no alternative, would keep using the dollar anyway? The gold was the constraint. Remove the gold, and the constraint vanished, and the privilege remained. The exorbitant privilege that Rueff had raged about would not end when the dollar left gold. It would become total. On the evening of Sunday, the 15th of August, 1971, Nixon went on national television and interrupted a popular program to address the country. He spoke about prosperity, about protecting the dollar from what he called international speculators, about strength. And buried in the speech, framed as a bold defensive action rather than the surrender it actually was, he announced that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, he said, the gold window was closed. Any foreign government holding dollars could no longer walk up and demand metal. The claim checks were, as of that Sunday night, worthless as claims on gold. They were now just paper. Backed by nothing but the American government's word and the world's lack of an alternative. It was called the Nixon shock, and the word shock is precise for the public but wrong for anyone who had read Triffin. To the men in that hearing room in 1959, this was not a shock. It was an appointment that had been on the calendar for over a decade. Everything Triffin had described came true in sequence. The deficits that supplied the world, the pile of foreign claims climbing past the gold, the crossing point in 1960, the decade of desperate improvisation, and finally the confidence collapse and the run, ending exactly as he said Road 2 would end, with the issuer unable to honour its promise and forced to abandon it. He had drawn the map in 1959. Nixon simply walked the last mile of it on live television in 1971. And here is the cruelty of it, the thing that makes Triffin's story genuinely bleak rather than triumphant. Being right did almost nothing for him. There was no great vindication, no moment where the people who had filed his testimony stood up and admitted he had seen it all. The system did not turn to its prophet and ask him what to do next. It turned to men like Connolly, who had no interest in fixing the contradiction and every interest in exploiting it. The lesson the powerful took from 1971 was not Triffin's lesson, that a national currency cannot safely serve as the world's reserve. The lesson they took was Connolly's lesson, that you could break the promise and get away with it, that the world would keep holding dollars even after the gold behind them was gone, that the privilege did not actually depend on the gold at all. The prophet was proved right and then ignored a second time, more completely than the first, because the collapse he predicted turned out to be survivable in a way that made his deeper warning easy to dismiss. Connolly put the entire philosophy of the new era into a single sentence, delivered to a room full of European finance ministers who had come to complain about the chaos the American decision had unleashed on their economies. They wanted to know what America was going to do about the disorder, about the wild swings in their currencies, about the damage. And Connolly looked at them and said that the dollar was America's currency, but it was their problem. The dollar is our currency, but your problem. It is one of the most revealing things any official has ever said, because it is the exact inversion of Triffin's entire worldview. Triffin believed the monetary system was a shared project, a peace project, a thing that had to serve everyone or it would eventually destroy everyone. Connolly believed it was a weapon that belonged to whoever held it, and Connolly, not Triffin, is the one whose philosophy won in 1971 and has governed the world ever since. there was one last attempt to hold the old world together. In December of 1971, the major economies met and signed the Smithsonian Agreement, which Nixon absurdly called the greatest monetary agreement in the history of the world. It devalued the dollar slightly against gold, adjusted the exchange rates, and tried to re-establish a system of fixed rates without the gold convertibility that had been their foundation. It was a corpse propped in a chair. It lasted a little over a year. By early 1973, the fixed rate system collapsed completely, and the major currencies began to float freely against one another, their values set moment to moment by markets rather than fixed by treaty. The world Keynes and White had built at Bretton Woods was finished. The gold anchor was gone, and the dollar, freed from the metal that had constrained it, did not fall from its throne as everyone had feared. It sat there, on a throne now made of nothing but confidence and habit and the absence of any alternative, and it ruled more completely than it ever had before. Which brings us to the strangest and most important turn in this entire story, the turn that takes it out of the history books and drops it directly onto your own bank statement. Because the obvious reading of 1971 is that Triffin's dilemma was resolved. The gold ran out, the promise broke, the system that contained the contradiction was dismantled. No more gold constraint, no more dilemma. Problem solved by demolition. That is the reading almost everyone takes, and it is the reading that lets the textbooks file the whole thing under history. And it is wrong. It is, exactly, dangerously wrong. Cutting the dollar loose from gold did not end the Triffin dilemma. It did something far worse. It removed the only part of the dilemma that was keeping anyone honest. And the trap, freed from its one measurable constraint, did not close. It opened wider than Triffin had ever imagined it could. To see why, you have to go back to what the gold was actually doing in the system, and it was doing two completely different jobs at once. The first job was obvious. Gold was the backing, the thing of value that stood behind the paper. But the second job was subtler and more important, and it is the job everyone forgets. Gold was the gauge. It was the measurement. As long as the dollar was convertible into gold, there was a hard, physical, countable limit that told the world how far the United States had overextended. Every ounce that flowed out of the vault was a number on a dial, a public, undeniable signal of how much the promise had been stretched. The gold drain of the 1960s was painful precisely because it was visible. You could count the tons leaving. You could watch the mountain shrink. The discipline of the gold standard was never really about the metal. It was about the fact that the metal could be counted, and counting created a limit, and the limit forced a reckoning. When Nixon closed the gold window, he did not just remove the backing, he removed the gauge. After 1971, foreign governments holding dollars could no longer convert them into anything. There was no window to run to, no metal to demand, no dial that would go red. The dollars in foreign hands were now purely a matter of confidence, and confidence has no fixed limit and no physical counter. Under gold, there was a specific moment, 1960, when you could say the claims had passed the metal and the promise was mathematically broken. After gold, there was no equivalent moment, not because the danger was gone, but because the instrument that measured it had been destroyed. The engine was still running. The fuel was still burning. Someone had simply removed the fuel gauge and painted over the hole. And freed from the gauge, the behaviour at the heart of the dilemma did not moderate. It accelerated, because now there was nothing to make it stop. Under Bretton Woods, the American deficit had been disciplined, however imperfectly, by the fear of the gold running out. Remove that fear and you remove the ceiling. The United States could now supply the world with as many dollars as the world wanted to hold. and the world. Having no alternative reserve asset of remotely comparable depth, wanted to hold a great many. The privilege became, as Connolly intended, total. America could run deficits without the gold constraint, buy the world's goods with paper it alone could print, and face no physical reckoning, because the reckoning mechanism had been dismantled. The exorbitant privilege that Rueff had raged about when it was merely large became, after 1971, effectively unlimited. The economists who came after Triffin gave the mutated version a name. They call it the fiscal Triffin dilemma, or the new Triffin dilemma, and the logic is a direct descendant of the original. Under gold, the constraint was the ratio of dollars to metal. In the fiat world, the constraint becomes the ratio of dollars to the credibility of the United States government itself, to its debt, its solvency, its capacity to be trusted indefinitely. To supply the world with its reserve asset, which is now not gold-backed dollars but United States government debt, American Treasury bonds, the United States must issue an ever-growing mountain of that debt. The world needs a safe asset to hold, and Treasury bonds are the safe asset, and so America must keep manufacturing them, must keep running the deficits that produce them, must keep the debt climbing to feed the global appetite for something safe to own. But the further that debt climbs, the more it strains the very credibility that made the bonds safe in the first place. It is the same contradiction, wearing new clothes. Supply the world and erode your own foundations, or defend your foundations and starve the world. The gold is gone, but the trap is identical. Only now there is no gauge to tell you how close to the edge you are, because the edge is not a physical quantity of metal anymore. It is a psychological quantity called confidence, and you cannot count confidence until the moment it breaks. Robert Triffin lived to watch this happen, and it is worth telling you what he did with the last chapter of his life, because it closes the circle I asked you to remember, and because it is the part of the story that I find genuinely hard to read without feeling something. After 1971, after being proved right and then ignored more thoroughly than ever, Triffin did not retreat into bitterness or victory laps. He went looking for the escape hatch again. He had always believed there was one, and it was the same one Keynes had proposed and lost with at Bretton Woods. Take the job of world money away from any single nation. Create a truly international reserve asset, managed collectively, belonging to no one country, so that no country would be forced into the deficits that fed the trap, and no country would hold the exorbitant privilege that corrupted it. Triffin had actually helped push one version of this into existence. In 1969, the International Monetary Fund had created a thing called special drawing rights, an artificial reserve asset, a kind of synthetic money issued by the fund itself, which many people saw as a partial realization of the old bancor idea, a first small step toward Keynes's neutral international currency. Triffin had argued for exactly this kind of instrument for years, and it went nowhere. Special drawing rights exist to this day, but they never came close to replacing the dollar, never became the reserve asset the world actually runs on. They remained a marginal accounting instrument, issued in trickles, politically constrained at every turn, because building them into a real alternative to the dollar would have required the United States to accept the end of its privilege. And the United States, holding all the power in the institution that would have to do it, had no reason to agree. The escape hatch was built, technically, and then bolted shut by the country that most needed the trap to stay open. It was Bretton Woods all over again. The alternative existed. The powerful said no. And so Triffin, now an old man, turned to the one place on earth that seemed willing to actually attempt the thing he had spent his life advocating. He went home. In 1977 he left the United States and returned to Europe, and in a detail that I told you at the beginning would close a circle, he gave back the American citizenship he had taken in 1942 as a refuge from the collapse of his continent. The Belgian who had become an American to escape a Europe consumed by war returned, decades later, to a Europe trying to build a peace, and he became one of the intellectual architects of the project he believed could finally break the dilemma. That project was European Monetary Union, the attempt by a group of nations to create a shared currency belonging to no single one of them. That would sit above all their national currencies the way Keynes had wanted bancor to sit above the currencies of the world. Triffin threw himself into it. He worked on the European unit of account, the forerunner of a currency that did not yet exist, and he became, in the histories of the euro, one of the founding minds behind it. To Triffin, the euro was not primarily an economic convenience. It was the closest the world had ever come to escaping the trap he had found. A reserve currency issued by no single nation. The bancor idea resurrected on one continent. He did not live to find out whether it would work. Robert Triffin died in February of 1993 in Ostend, in the country where he had been born, having come all the way back to the beginning. He died a few months after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, the agreement that formally set Europe on the road to the single currency. He lived just long enough to see the treaty signed, and not long enough to see the euro actually created, not long enough to see whether the escape hatch he had spent his life building would hold or fail. He was made a baron by the King of Belgium near the end, a small honour from a small country, for a man who had tried to redesign the money of the world and had been overruled at every decisive moment by the one country powerful enough to overrule him. And I have to tell you, with the honesty this subject demands, that the jury on his escape hatch is still out, and the early verdict is not kind. The euro exists. It is the second reserve currency of the world, but its share of global reserves sits at only around a fifth, and it has its own deep structural problems, and it has come nowhere near displacing the dollar. The one serious attempt to build a currency belonging to no single nation has not escaped the dilemma so much as demonstrated how hard the dilemma is to escape. Because even a currency shared among many nations turns out to carry contradictions of its own. Triffin's life's work, the thing he came home to build, remains an experiment whose outcome is unsettled, running right now, on the continent where he was born and died. But the euro is a sideshow to the thing that actually matters, and the thing that actually matters is what happened to the original trap after its gauge was removed. Because for the last 50 years, the world has been running Triffin's machine a second time, in the Fiat era, with no gold to constrain it and no gauge to measure it, and the numbers that machine has produced in our own time are not numbers Triffin ever saw. They are far past anything he watched cross in 1960. And the question that should be keeping you up, the question the entire first run of this story was designed to prepare you to ask, is a simple one. If the crossing point in the first run was 1960, the silent year when the claims first passed the gold, then in this second run, the Fiat run, the run with no gauge. Where is our crossing point? Has it not happened yet? Or did it happen years ago, in a year when everything still looked fine, with no gold left to tell us we had passed it? There is a question hiding in everything I have just told you, and if you are thinking clearly, it should already be bothering you. If cutting the dollar loose from gold removed its backing and its gauge, if the promise underneath it became officially nothing in 1971, then why did the dollar not simply fall? Why is it still here, 50 years later, more dominant than ever? The logic of the trap says confidence should have cracked. The gold was gone. The emperor had publicly admitted he had no clothes. By every intuition, that should have been the end of the dollar's reign, not the beginning of its most powerful era. Then what held it up? Two things held it up, and both of them are worth understanding, because one of them is the clearest proof you will ever get that Triffin was right, and the other is the reason the reckoning got postponed by half a century. Start with the proof, because it is sitting in plain sight and almost nobody reads it correctly. When the dollar was cut loose from gold, gold itself was finally allowed to float, to find its real price in the open market, instead of being pinned at the official $35 an ounce that the London gold pool had died defending. And when it floated, it did not drift. It erupted. Gold went from $35 an ounce, the sacred fixed number that had anchored the entire post-war world, to over $800 an ounce by the start of 1980. In under a decade, it took more than $20 of the new unbacked currency to buy what $1 had bought in gold before the window closed. Read that as what it actually is. That is not gold becoming more valuable. Gold is inert. It does not change. That is the dollar revealing, in the one price that was finally free to tell the truth, how little it had really been worth all along, how far the promise had already been stretched by 1971, how much value had already drained out of it in the years the official price had been holding the lie in place. The invisible default I described, the fiat kind that shows up as erosion rather than as an event, was not invisible in the 1970s. For one decade you could see it, because gold was holding up a mirror to the dollar, and the mirror showed a currency that had quietly lost most of its value while insisting on its face that nothing had changed. Inflation in the United States climbed into the double digits, savings were gutted, and the dollar lost against the one asset that could not be printed, the overwhelming majority of its worth. Triffin said Road 2 ended in a collapse of the currency's value. It did. It just arrived wearing the mask of inflation instead of the mask of a broken gold window. Exactly as the fiat version of the trap requires, and the world learned to call it by a dozen names other than what it was. The value collapsed, on schedule, in the one place it could still be measured. But the throne did not, and that is the second thing, the postponement, and it is the reason the dollar's story did not end in 1979 the way sterling's story ended after its own overextension. Because in the middle of that decade, as the dollar's value bled out, a new prop slid into place under the throne, and it did the same job the gold had done, recreating a permanent global hunger for dollars. But it did it without any promise that could ever run out, which made it far more durable than gold had ever been. The prop was oil. In the wake of the oil shocks of the 1970s, when the price of crude quadrupled and the oil-exporting nations suddenly held enormous power, the world's oil settled into being priced and paid for, overwhelmingly, in dollars. Every barrel, everywhere, quoted in dollars. And the surpluses the exporters earned, oceans of dollars, flowed back into American debt and Western banks, a circulation that came to be called Petrodollar recycling. Think about what that did to the trap. Under gold, the world needed dollars because dollars were convertible into metal. Remove the metal, and you remove that reason to want dollars. But if the one commodity that every industrial economy on Earth must buy to function, the commodity that runs every factory and every truck and every military, can only be bought in dollars, then every nation on Earth needs a steady supply of dollars just to keep its lights on, regardless of whether those dollars are backed by anything at all. The dollar was re-anchored, not to a mountain of gold that could be counted and drained, but to the world's absolute dependence on oil, a dependence with no vault and no gauge, and nothing that could run out. It was a more perfect prop than gold, because gold could be demanded and depleted, and oil priced in dollars could not. The exorbitant privilege was not just preserved after 1971, it was rebuilt on a foundation that had no bottom to hit. But notice what that prop actually is, because this is where it folds back into everything Triffin understood. Pricing oil in dollars did not solve the contradiction. It did exactly what the London gold pool did in the 1960s. It bought time. It recreated the demand for dollars that kept the system running, which meant it recreated the obligation for America to supply those dollars, which meant it recreated the deficits, the overextension, the climbing pile of claims with no gauge to measure them. The petrodollar did not lift the dollar out of the trap. It fed the trap a new and richer fuel and let it run for another 50 years. And it planted a specific vulnerability that matters enormously right now. Because if the dollar's post-gold dominance was rebuilt on the world buying oil in dollars, then the single most dangerous thing that could happen to the dollar is the world beginning to buy oil and other essential commodities in something else. Which is precisely the thing that a growing number of nations, the same ones flying their gold home in the dark, have quietly begun to explore. The prop that saved the dollar in the 1970s is the exact prop whose loosening would end it, and it is loosening. That is the shape of the last 50 years. A currency that should have fallen when its backing was removed, whose value did collapse in the one mirror still able to show it, but whose throne was saved by a new prop that bought half a century of postponement while feeding the underlying contradiction the entire time. Which brings us, finally, to the numbers of our own era, the numbers that 50 years of postponement have produced. And they are numbers that no one who sat in that 1959 hearing room could have imagined a currency could survive carrying. Start with the thing the dollar does now that it could never do under gold. It borrows without limit, and the world lends without hesitation, and the amount it has borrowed has reached a scale that breaks the human ability to feel numbers at all. As of the middle of this decade, the total debt of the United States government passed $39 trillion. Say that number slowly, because your brain will try to round it off into meaninglessness, which is exactly the reflex that lets it stay invisible. 39 trillion. When Triffin sat in that hearing room in 1959, worried that a few $1 billion of foreign claims were about to pass the American gold stock, the total federal debt was a small fraction of a single trillion. The pile of claims he watched cross the gold in 1960, the pile whose crossing he considered the quiet beginning of the end, would not register as a rounding error against what the United States owes today. The debt is now larger than the entire annual economic output of the country. It is growing by roughly $1 trillion every 5 months or so, faster in the bad stretches. There is no mountain of gold behind any of it. There is no gauge. There is only the belief, held by every central bank and pension fund and foreign government on earth. That United States government debt is the safest thing you can own, the closest thing the modern world has to gold, the asset you run to when everything else is on fire. And that belief is not irrational, which is the maddening part. Treasury bonds really are the deepest, most liquid, most trusted financial instrument in the world. They function as the foundation of the entire global financial system. When a bank in Singapore or a central bank in Brazil wants to hold something safe, it holds American debt. That is the fiat version of the gold promise, and it is the fiat version of the trap. Because the same logic Triffin drew in 1959 still runs underneath it, unchanged, the world needs a safe reserve asset. The safe reserve asset is American debt. For the world to have enough of it, America must keep producing it, must keep running the deficits that manufacture it, must keep the debt climbing. And every increment of climb strains, by a fraction no one can measure, the credibility that makes the debt safe. Supply the world and erode yourself. The gold is gone. The trap is exactly where he left it. Here is a way to feel the scale of what the privilege has become. The United States runs a deficit with the rest of the world, a gap between what it buys from abroad and what it sells, and it has run one, almost without interruption, for around half a century, since not long after the gold window closed. Year after year, decade after decade, America consumes more from the world than it provides to the world, and it settles the difference in dollars it creates. Under gold, that gap would have drained the vault in a few years and forced a reckoning. Under fiat, the gap simply accumulates as foreign holdings of dollars and dollar debt, a mountain of claims that grows without any physical limit, because there is nothing at the bottom of it that can run out. Triffin watched a version of this drain 20,000 tons of gold down to 8,000 in about 25 years, and considered it a catastrophe. We have run the same imbalance, unbounded, for 50 years, and called it normal, because without the gauge there is no tonnage falling, no dial going red. Nothing to count but a debt figure that everyone has agreed to treat as weightless. Now, I promised you honesty on the contested points, and this is the most contested point in the entire subject, so I am going to give you the real disagreement instead of a tidy answer, because the disagreement itself is revealing. There is a serious camp of monetary economists who argue that the Triffin dilemma, in its classic form, was always somewhat overstated and is largely a myth in the modern world. Their argument is not stupid. They point out that the original dilemma depended entirely on the gold convertibility promise, on that fixed physical anchor that could run out, and that once you remove the gold, you remove the hard constraint, and a currency that can be created freely cannot run out of itself the way gold could run out. A country that issues its own fiat currency, they argue, can always create more of it, can never be forced to default on debt denominated in money it controls, and therefore the crossing point that doomed Bretton Woods simply does not exist in the same way. The dollar cannot bounce a check written in dollars. In this view, the dollar's dominance is stable, self-reinforcing, and the talk of a built-in self-destruct is a hangover from the gold era that does not apply to the world we actually live in. This is not a fringe position, and I want to give it its real weight before I tell you why I think it is wrong. Two economists in particular, Michael Bordeaux and Robert Macaulay, wrote a careful and influential paper arguing that the Triffin dilemma, at least in the strong form where it made the collapse of Bretton Woods inevitable, is closer to a myth than a law, that the actual breakdown owed more to specific policy failures and the rigidity of the fixed gold price than to any deep unavoidable. Contradiction. Serious people find this convincing. On the other side stands a lineage that runs the other way. Barry Eichengreen, who wrote the definitive modern book on the dollar's dominance and gave the phrase exorbitant privilege its scholarly home, has spent a career documenting how central and how strange the dollar's position really is. How much of the global system depends on the willingness of one country to supply the world's safe asset, and a set of contemporary thinkers, most prominently Michael Pettis, have revived and sharpened the dilemma for the fiat age, arguing that the dollar's reserve role is not a free privilege at all, but a genuine burden that forces the United States to absorb the world's excess savings and imbalances, running the deficits and hollowing out parts of its own economy as the price of keeping the world supplied. In this telling, the exorbitant privilege is also an exorbitant curse, and it binds exactly the way Triffin said it would, just through a different channel than gold. The field itself is split, right now, between people who think Triffin described a solved historical accident, and people who think he described a live and deepening trap. And the fact that the professional economists cannot agree on whether the foundation of the world's monetary system contains a fatal flaw is not a reassuring sign about the foundation, and the myth camp has a point about the mechanism. But I think they are answering the wrong question, and here is where I will take a position. Because the whole purpose of this is to think harder than the reassuring version allows. The gold era dilemma ended in a run on the vault. The fiat era dilemma does not end in a run on the vault, because there is no vault. It ends somewhere else. The constraint in the fiat world was never supposed to be gold running out. The constraint is confidence running out, and confidence is not protected by the fact that you can always print more dollars. Confidence is destroyed by the fact that you can always print more dollars. A country that can never be forced to default in nominal terms can still destroy the value of what it owes by creating too much of it, and the world knows this, and so the escape hatch the myth camp points to. The ability to always print more is not an escape from the trap at all, it is the trap in its final form. Under gold, overextension showed up as a shrinking pile of metal. Under fiat, overextension shows up as a slow erosion of the belief that the currency will hold its value, and that erosion has no gauge, no dial, no tonnage. You cannot see it until it becomes a stampede, which means the fiat version is not safer than the gold version, it is more dangerous, because it is invisible until the end. And if you want to know whether that erosion of confidence is actually happening, or whether it is just the anxiety of pessimists, you do not have to guess, because the central banks of the world are voting with their reserves, and the vote is not close. For most of the last century, when a central bank wanted a safe reserve, it bought dollars, or dollar debt. That was the whole point of the system. But watch what they have actually been doing lately. In each of the years 2022, 2023, and 2024, the central banks of the world collectively bought more than 1,000 tons of gold. More than 1,000 tons, 3 years running. To understand how strange that is, you have to know that for the decade before it, the average was around 470 tons a year. The central banks of the world roughly doubled their rate of gold accumulation and held it there, buying gold at a pace not seen since the era when gold still officially backed money. These are the same institutions that are supposed to hold dollars. They are the professionals. They run the reserves of nations. And they have spent the last several years quietly trading a growing share of their paper claims for the one asset that no government can print. The one asset that cannot be frozen or inflated away by a foreign power. The asset the entire modern system was supposedly designed to move beyond. When the people who manage the world's reserves start backing away from the reserve currency and toward the metal it replaced, that is not noise. That is the gauge that does not exist reasserting itself, the old instinct for accountable limit, breaking through in the behavior of the people closest to the machine. At the same time, the dollar's share of the world's official reserves has been sliding for 2 decades. Around the turn of the millennium, something over 70% of the world's allocated reserves were held in dollars. That share has fallen, unevenly but persistently, to somewhere just under 57% in the most recent figures. It has not collapsed. The dollar is not being abandoned in a panic. But the direction is one direction, and it has held for 20 years, and it points down. Surveys of central banks themselves show a majority expecting gold to make up a larger share of their reserves in the years ahead, and a similar majority expecting the dollar's share to keep shrinking. The professionals are telling you, in their own reported plans, where they think this goes. And here is the third foreshadow, the last time I am going to point at the thing waiting at the end before we walk into it. Remember the shape of the first run. The system did not break in 1971, it broke in 1960, silently, at the crossing point, and spent 11 years pretending otherwise until the pretense became impossible. The collapse was just the moment the world admitted what had already happened. Now look at what the central banks are doing, the gold buying, the slow retreat from the dollar, the quiet diversification. Ask yourself what that behavior would look like if the second crossing point, the fiat one, the invisible one with no gold to market, were already behind us. Ask yourself whether the professionals backing away from the dollar are predicting a future crisis, or quietly responding to a crossing that already happened in some year that looked completely normal that we will only be able to name in hindsight. The way 1960 could only be named as the beginning of the end long after 1960 was over. The first run tells you that by the time the crisis is visible, the crossing is ancient history, and the people whose job is to watch the gauge that no longer exists have already started moving toward the exit. There is a newer turn of the screw that Triffin never lived to see, and it has made the trap sharper than the pure arithmetic ever could, because it added a second reason for the world to want out, on top of the reason he identified. Connolly's philosophy, the dollar is our currency but your problem, contained an implication that took decades to fully surface. If the dollar is a weapon that belongs to whoever holds it, then holding it is not just an economic convenience for the rest of the world, it is a vulnerability. Every nation that keeps its reserves in dollars, that settles its trade in dollars, that holds American debt as its safe asset, is trusting that the country issuing that money will never turn the money against it. For most of the post-war era that trust held, because the dollar's power came precisely from its neutrality, from the sense that it was simply the water everyone swam in, rather than a lever any one hand could pull. But the lever was always there, and in recent years the United States has shown, repeatedly and deliberately, that it will pull it. The clearest demonstration came when a major power had a very large portion of its foreign reserves, hundreds of billions of dollars held in the Western financial system, frozen in place, rendered inert, cut off from its owner as an instrument of geopolitical pressure. Set aside entirely what you think about the politics of who it was done to and why, because the politics are not the point here. The point is what every other central banker on earth learned by watching it happen. They learned that dollar reserves are only yours until the issuer decides they are not. They learned that the safe asset is safe only as long as you remain on good terms with the country that controls it. They learned that the exorbitant privilege has a sharper edge than Ref ever imagined, that it includes the power to reach across the world and switch off another nation's savings. And a central banker who has learnt that lesson looks at their own pile of dollars and dollar debt very differently the next morning. They look at it and see, for the first time, not a fortress, but a leash. That is why the gold buying is not just an economic hedge against inflation. It is a political flight to the one asset that cannot be frozen from a distance, cannot be switched off, cannot be turned into a weapon against its holder. Gold sitting in a vault inside your own country's borders answers to no foreign government. That is why, alongside the record buying, nations have been physically repatriating their gold, pulling it out of foreign vaults where it has sat for decades and flying it home, so that it sits on their own soil under their own control. Countries that had trusted others to hold their gold for half a century have been quietly bringing it back. This is not the behaviour of a world confident in the dollar system. It is the behaviour of a world beginning, cautiously, to build lifeboats, while insisting, publicly, that the ship is fine. And the ship is fine, for now. Which is the cruelest feature of the whole thing, and the reason nothing changes. Because here is the trap inside the trap. The reason the dollar's decline is so slow and so deniable. There is no alternative. This is the sentence that every defender of dollar stability reaches for, and they are correct, and their correctness is not comforting. It is the most disturbing thing about the situation. The euro carries its own contradictions and has never come close to displacing the dollar. The Chinese currency is controlled by a state that does not permit the free movement of capital, which disqualifies it from being a true global reserve, because a reserve currency has to be something the world can move in and out of freely, and no country that wants to control its currency can allow that. The various efforts by groups of nations to build alternative payment systems, to trade in their own currencies, to construct something outside the dollar, have all run into the same wall Keynes ran into in 1944 and Triffin ran into with special drawing rights. Building a real alternative requires a level of trust and surrender of national control that no group of rival nations has been willing to provide. And so the world stays in the dollar, not because it trusts the dollar, but because it has nowhere else to go that is any better. Think carefully about what that actually means, because it is the modern shape of Triffin's contradiction, and it is genuinely bleak. The world is trapped in a reserve system it increasingly distrusts, run on a currency whose issuer has shown it will weaponize it, backed by a debt that grows without limit and without a gauge, and it cannot leave, because every exit leads somewhere worse. The dollar's dominance is not held up by confidence anymore. Not really. It is held up by the absence of an alternative. It rules by default, the way a bad option wins when every other option is disqualified. And a system held together by the absence of alternatives, rather than the presence of trust, is not stable. It is brittle. It holds and holds and holds, looking stable the entire time, right up until someone builds the alternative, or until the distrust finally overwhelms the inertia, and then it does not decline gracefully. It breaks the way 1971 broke, all at once, after a long silence, as the sudden public admission of something that had already been true for years. Now let me name the abdication directly, because it has been building under this whole story and it deserves to be said plainly. Where are the institutions on this? Where is the clear, honest public accounting from the people whose job is to steward the system? The Federal Reserve does not talk about the Triffin dilemma in its press conferences. The Treasury does not stand up and explain that the reserve status of the dollar requires deficits that strain the nation's long-term solvency. The International Monetary Fund, the institution born at Bretton Woods, the institution Triffin himself served, has published papers acknowledging the fiscal Triffin dilemma in careful academic language, buried in working papers that no one outside the field will ever read, and then its officials go to the podium and reassure everyone that the dollar's dominance is intact and the system is sound. The people who understand this best are the quietest about it in public, and they are quiet for the same reason the men in 1960 were quiet. Naming the contradiction does not help you manage it. It only accelerates the loss of confidence that is the contradiction's endpoint. The institutional strategy, now as then, is to know privately and reassure publicly, to acknowledge the trap in a footnote and deny it from the stage, because the one thing you must never do with a confidence-based system is tell the truth about how little is actually holding it up. This is the part that should genuinely make you angry, and I want you to sit in that anger rather than talk yourself out of it, because the anger is appropriate. You were not told this, not because it is secret, not because it is fringe, not because it is speculative. It is none of those things. It is in the textbooks, under a name, taught as history. It is in the working papers of the most respectable institutions on earth. The man who diagnosed it testified to your Congress and published it with a great university's press. The historical episode that proved him right is one of the most consequential economic events of the 20th century, and it happened on live television. Every piece of this is public, documented, verified, and it has been for over 60 years. And yet the through line, the thing that connects Triffin's 1959 warning to the $39 trillion debt and the central banks fleeing into gold, the recognition that these are the same machine running its second lap, is almost never drawn for you. Because drawing it requires saying out loud that the foundation of the global financial order contains a flaw that cannot be fixed, only postponed, and that is not a thing the stewards of that order can afford to say while they are still trying to postpone it. The stewards are not lying to you. Exactly. That is what makes it so effective. They are doing what the men in 1960 did. They are managing a confidence game in the technical sense, a system that runs on belief, and they understand that their job is to preserve the belief, and preserving the belief means never fully explaining the thing underneath it. They will keep the dollar aloft the way the London gold pool kept the gold price aloft, by spending down the reserves of trust, intervening whenever confidence wobbles. burning credibility to hide the scarcity of credibility for exactly as long as they can, which is a long time, until the day it is suddenly not. And underneath all of it, under the deficits and the debt and the gold buying and the careful institutional silence, the machine grinds on with a logic that starts to feel less like economics and more like something with a will of its own. Because notice what the system requires. It requires the United States to weaken itself in order to serve the world. It requires the anchor of the entire structure to slowly corrode itself, deficit by deficit, trillion by trillion, precisely because it is the anchor. The stronger the dollar's role becomes, the more the world demands of it, and the more the world demands of it. The more the issuer must overextend to supply it, and the more it overextends, the more it undermines the foundation the whole thing rests on. Success feeds the demand that erodes the success. The reserve currency is not destroyed despite its dominance. It is destroyed by its dominance, through its dominance, as the direct and unavoidable price of its dominance. The system needs its own foundation to rot. It requires the thing at its centre to consume itself. And it has required this from the very beginning, from the room in New Hampshire in 1944, because the flaw was never in the management. The flaw was in the idea. And that is the thing Triffin saw, and the thing the textbooks turn into a footnote. And the thing we are now going to have to follow all the way down to its final implication. Because if the flaw is in the idea itself, then it does not just apply to the dollar, it applies to whatever comes next. Here is the fact that turns this from a story about the dollar into something much larger and much colder. The dollar is not the first currency to sit on this throne, and every single one that sat here before it died in the same chair, of the same disease, for the same reason. Before the dollar, the world ran on the British pound. For roughly a century, through the 1700s and 1800s and into the 20th, sterling was what the dollar is now, the currency of global trade, the reserve every central bank held, the money the world settled its accounts in. Britain was the issuer, the banker to the planet, the holder of the exorbitant privilege before America inherited it, and Britain walked the exact path Triffin would later map. To be the world's banker, Britain had to supply the world with sterling, had to let its currency and its capital flow out across the empire and beyond, had to run the position of a country whose money everyone else needed to hold. And that role, glorious as it looked from the inside, steadily outgrew the actual economic base underneath it. The claims on Britain grew faster than Britain's capacity to honour them. By the time the 20th century arrived, sterling was a currency whose global role had become far larger than the shrinking real economy that was supposed to back it, a promise stretched thinner every year over a foundation that was not growing to match. 2 world wars accelerated it, but the wars did not cause it. The wars just did to sterling quickly what the dilemma would have done to it slowly. Britain bled its position dry, and the pound fell from the throne, and the dollar, waiting in the wings with its mountain of gold, took the seat that sterling could no longer hold. And go back further, and you find it again. Before sterling, the Dutch guilder held a version of this role in the 16 and 1700s, when Amsterdam was the financial centre of the world, and it too eventually gave way. Before the Dutch, the Venetians and the Genoese and the Florentines, whose coins were accepted across the medieval and Renaissance world, rose and held the role and lost it. The specific mechanisms differ across the centuries. The gold convertibility promise was particular to the dollar's era, but the deep pattern is the same in every case, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A rising power becomes the issuer of the money the world trusts. That trust requires it to supply the world, to let its money become everyone's money, to take on a global role. The global role grows until it exceeds the base that supports it. The claims outrun the capacity. Confidence, held aloft for a long time by habit and by the absence of an alternative, eventually finds an alternative, or simply exhausts itself, and the currency falls, and a new one rises to take the throne and begin the same cycle again. Triffin thought he was describing a flaw in the Bretton Woods system. He was actually describing a flaw in the position itself, a flaw that has recurred in different clothing for as long as there have been currencies that the whole world agreed to trust. This is why the reassuring argument, the one that says the dollar is fine because there is no alternative, misses the point so completely. The pound had no alternative either, right up until the moment it did. For decades, the idea that sterling could be displaced was unthinkable to the people inside the system, because there was nowhere else for the world's money to go. And then, gradually, and then suddenly, there was. The absence of an alternative is not a permanent condition. It is the condition that exists in the long, deceptive middle of the cycle, the calm stretch after the crossing point and before the collapse, when the incumbent currency rules by default and everyone mistakes the lack of a replacement for the impossibility of one. That is precisely where we are now. That is what the calm feels like from the inside. It felt exactly like this to hold pounds in 1900, when the sun did not set on the empire, and the very idea of sterling's fall was a joke told by cranks. And this is where the deepest implication finally comes into focus, the one I have been walking you toward since the first minutes of this. The one that turns Triffin's dry economic contradiction into something that should genuinely change how you look at the money in your own account. If the flaw is in the position and not in any particular currency, then it does not matter what comes next. It does not matter whether the dollar is eventually replaced by the euro, or by the Chinese currency, or by some basket of currencies, or by a digital instrument, or by a revived version of Keynes's bancor, or by gold itself. Whatever inherits the throne will inherit the disease. The moment any currency becomes the world's reserve, it enters the trap. The world will demand it. To supply the world, its issuer will overextend. The overextension will erode the foundation. The claims will outrun the capacity. And in some quiet year that looks completely ordinary, that new currency will cross its own version of the 1960 line, silently, with no one to mark it, and begin its own long, slow march toward a collapse that its holders will not see coming until it is already behind them. The throne is not a seat of power. It is a sentence, and it is handed down, from the Florentine florin to the Venetian ducat, to the Dutch guilder, to the British pound, to the American dollar, to whatever is foolish enough to want the crown next. Each one certain it will be the exception, each one carrying the identical flaw baked into the identical position, each one issued at the very moment of its triumph, with the mechanism of its own destruction already installed and already running. That is what Triffin really found in 1959, though he described it in the narrow language of gold and dollars, because that was the machine in front of him. He found that being the world's money is not a reward. It is a slow-acting poison that a currency drinks in exchange for a few decades on the throne, and the drinking is not optional, because the poison and the crown are the same cup. The strength is the illness. The dominance is the decay. There is no version where a currency serves the whole world and survives it, because the serving is the thing that kills it. He spent his life looking for the antidote, the neutral international money that no nation would have to poison itself to provide, and he never found a version the world would actually swallow, and neither has anyone since. The escape hatch has been designed over and over, from bancor to special drawing rights to the euro, and it has been refused or defanged or left running as an unfinished experiment every single time, because building it requires the currency currently on the throne to willingly climb down. And no currency in the history of the world has ever climbed down. they have to be carried out. And so the machine runs. It is running right now, over your head, in the $39 trillion of debt, and the deficits with no gauge, and the central banks quietly trading their paper for metal, and flying their gold home in the dark. The second lap of the exact clock Triffin read in 1959 is well underway, and if the first lap is any guide, the crossing point that will define it is not somewhere ahead of us waiting to be avoided. It is somewhere behind us, already past, in a year that felt completely normal, and the movements we can see now, the gold, the diversification, the lifeboats being quietly lowered, are not warnings of a distant storm. They are the early, deniable, ancient in hindsight signs of a system that has already silently begun to fail and is spending its long, calm middle pretending, the way it pretended from 1960 to 1971, that the pretending can go on forever. I want to be precise about what the ending looks like this time, because the Fiat collapse does not wear the same face as the gold collapse, and if you are watching for the wrong face, you will not recognize it until it is finished. In 1971, the failure had a body. There was a gold window, a physical place where the promise lived, and the failure was the closing of that window. An event, a date, a president on television. It was visible because gold is a thing, and running out of a thing is an event you can point to. The Fiat version has no window to close, because there is no promise of conversion into anything. The failure cannot arrive as an event of that kind. It has to arrive as something stranger and harder to see. It arrives as the slow, deniable erosion of what the money will buy. When a country with the exorbitant privilege overextends under a gold standard, it loses gold, and you can count the loss. When a country overextends under fiat, it does not lose anything countable. Instead, the value of the money it has issued quietly drains away, and that draining shows up in your life not as a headline, but as a feeling. The feeling that everything costs more than it used to, that your salary buys less than it did, that the ground is soft in a way you cannot quite name. That is what a fiat default looks like. It does not announce itself. It does not close a window. It simply, gradually, makes the promise worth less, while the promise still says the same number on its face, and it can do this for a very long time, before anyone is willing to call it what it is. And here is the part that puts you inside the machine, not watching it from the stands. You have been thinking about this as something that happens to central banks and governments, to piles of reserves in distant vaults. It is not. The dollars in your own account are part of the same pile. They are the same claims. When Triffin talked about the mass of dollars held outside the system growing past the ability to honour them, he was not talking about some special foreign category of dollar. A dollar is a dollar. The claim that a central bank in another country holds, and the claim sitting in your checking account, are the identical instrument, backed by the identical nothing, dependent on the identical confidence. You are not an observer of the confidence game. You are a player in it, whether you agreed to play or not, because you hold the chips. Every dollar you have ever saved is a bet that the belief holds. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal structure of the money. It is worth what it is worth, because everyone agrees it is. And your savings are your stake in that agreement, and the agreement is the thing that Triffin showed cannot hold forever. This is why the absence of a gauge matters so much more than it sounds like it should. Under gold, you would have had a warning. You could have watched the tonnage fall, seen the reserves drain, known that the moment was approaching. The gauge would have given you time to move. In the fiat system there is no gauge, and the absence of the gauge is not a neutral fact. It is specifically designed, whether anyone intended it or not, to keep you in your seat until the last possible moment, because confidence is the one economic quantity that cannot be measured until it fails, the people holding the currency, which is everyone, which is you, receive no signal, no dial, no falling needle, right up until the confidence breaks, and when it breaks it, does not break slowly. Confidence is not like gold. Gold drains an ounce at a time. Confidence holds at full strength, looking completely solid, giving no warning whatsoever, and then it goes all at once, in a rush, as everyone who had been quietly worried decides in the same short window to stop pretending. The calm is not evidence of safety. In a confident system, the calm is the mechanism that ensures the maximum number of people are still holding when it ends. The stillness of the needle is not telling you the engine is fine. There is no needle. That is the whole problem. And the professionals know this. That is what the gold buying is. That is what the repatriation is. The flying home of metal in the dark. The people closest to the machine, the central bankers who cannot see a gauge any better than you can, have fallen back on the only strategy available to someone who knows the warning will not come, which is to quietly move toward the exit while the room is still calm, before the rush. Precisely because they know there will be no signal to tell them when the rush begins. They are not predicting the date. Nobody can predict the date, because there is no gauge to predict from. They are simply refusing to be in the crowd when the confidence goes, and they are refusing early, because early is the only safe time to refuse. Which means the movement you can see right now, the slow retreat, is not the beginning of the warning. It is the professionals responding to the fact that there will be no warning. The smart money is not waiting for the gauge. It has accepted that the gauge is gone, and it is leaving in the calm, and the calm is all you will ever get. I have gone looking, harder than I expected to, for the flaw in this, for the reason it is not as bad as it sounds, and I want to tell you honestly where I have landed, because the whole point of this was to think past the reassuring version. The reassuring version says the dollar is dominant, the system is stable, there is no alternative, and everything is fine. And every single clause of that is true. The dollar is dominant, the system is stable, there is no alternative. And none of it is reassuring, because every one of those things was equally true of the pound in 1900, and equally true of the dollar itself in 1960, in the calm middle, after the crossing, before the fall. Stability in the middle of the cycle is not evidence against the cycle. It is what the middle of the cycle feels like. The dominance is not protection. The dominance is the disease. And the lack of an alternative is not a flaw under the dollar. It is the last calm stretch before someone builds one, exactly as someone always, eventually, has. I keep coming back to Triffin himself, at the end of this, because his life turns out to be shaped exactly like the thing he discovered, and I do not think that is an accident so much as it is the reason he was able to see it at all. He was born in Belgium in 1911, into the calm before a collapse, a child in a small town in the last years of an old European order that was about to destroy itself in the first of two wars. He watched that order fail. He grew up in its wreckage. And when the second collapse came, when the Nazis rolled into the country of his birth in 1940, he did what people do when the ground gives way beneath them. He fled to the strongest, safest, most solid thing available, the country whose vaults held 2/3 of the world's gold, the country whose currency was about to become the money of the entire planet. In 1942, Robert Triffin became an American, and America in 1942 was the closest thing to permanence that the modern world had ever produced. He ran from a collapsing order and took shelter inside what looked like an unshakable one, and then he spent the rest of his life discovering, from the inside, that the unshakable thing he had run to was built on the same kind of contradiction as the order he had fled, that the strength he had taken shelter in was a slow-acting instability wearing the mask of permanence, that the dollar's dominance was not the opposite of collapse, but merely an earlier, calmer stage of it. He had escaped one falling structure by climbing into another one that had not started falling yet, and he was one of the very few people alive who could see, from inside the second structure, in the numbers on the ledgers, that it had already quietly begun to go. He tried to warn them. They filed the warning. He tried to build the escape. They refused the escape. He was proved right in 1971, and the world took the wrong lesson from being right and used his vindication as a reason to run the machine harder with the gauge torn out. And in the end, an old man now, he did the only thing left to do. He went home. In 1977, he gave back the American citizenship he had taken as Shelter 30 5 years earlier. The shelter that had turned out to be another version of the storm, and he returned to the small country he had come from, and he spent his final years trying to help build, on his own continent, a currency belonging to no single nation. The escape hatch he had been designing his whole life under a dozen different names. He died in Ostend in early 1993, near where he had been born, a few months after Europe signed the treaty that would create that currency, and years before anyone could know whether it would save them or simply prove, one more time, how inescapable the trap really is. He closed the circle of his own life. He did not get to close the circle of his idea. It is still open. It is open right now. And that leaves you where it leaves me, which is holding a currency that Triffin showed us cannot last, in a system that has already torn out the only instrument that could tell us how close the end is, in the long calm middle of a cycle that has repeated itself for 600 years and shows no sign of having found an exception this time. The dollars are in your account tonight. They will be there tomorrow. They will buy roughly what they bought last week, and that steadiness will feel like safety, and the feeling of safety is the last thing the system gives you before it stops. You will get no warning that is not visible to everyone at once, which means you will get no useful warning at all. The professionals are already moving. The gold is already flying home in the dark. The debt is past 39 trillion and climbing by 1 trillion every few months. And there is nothing behind it, and there is no gauge to tell you how far past the line we already are. Because the whole point of what happened in 1971 was to remove the line so that no one would ever have to watch us cross it. Triffin found the floor in 1959. He was right about the first collapse to the season. He told us the floor could not be fixed, only postponed, and everything since has been the postponement. The reserve currency is not failing because someone made a mistake. It is failing because it succeeded, because the success is the failure. Because the throne was always a slow execution, dressed as a coronation. Every currency that has ever ruled the world was handed, on the day of its triumph, a mechanism of its own undoing, installed at the centre of the very thing that made it strong, running quietly from the first day of dominance to the last. The dollar is not the exception. There has never been an exception. There is only the calm, and the crossing you cannot see, and the long pretending, and then the morning the pretending stops. The money in your pocket is a promise. It was always a promise. And the man who understood promises like this better than anyone who ever lived told a room full of the most powerful people on earth 65 years ago exactly how this one ends. They wrote it down, they filed it, and they went back to spending